Today we're going to take a look at the Top Coder Challenge for the Command Line Address Book Part 3. Now Part 3 asks us to build the last three methods of the address book. These methods are search for an entry, import a CSV file, and finally exit out of the address book. So if we take a look at our menu for this address book command line, we can see that the entries built in are number 1, view all entries, 2, create an entry, 3, search for an entry, 4, import entries from a CSV, and 5, exit. Now, again, this address book is a collection of entries that are built using the entry class. Now, this entry class is simply a data container that holds a name, a phone number, and an email address. And it also contains a method that will display the entry via its name, phone, and email address. As I said, each of the address books is just a container for each of those entries. Now, to build the address book, I've done a couple of things. The first is I'm requiring this URI. Now, the URI is going to allow me to check an email address entry in order to make sure that it's in the proper format. So it has to have a username, an @ symbol, and a domain address for each of the email addresses that are being passed in. If it's not a valid email address, then again, this is part of the validity checks. It will continue to ask the user for a valid email address until it's given one. The next is I'm requiring the relative file entry. Now again, require relative looks for a file within the same directory as the item that's it's being imported into. Again, we are passing entries into our address book into the entries container. So we need to know what an entry is. The next line is a valid phone number regex. Now, in the previous iteration of this, we didn't really check for phone number validity other than that it it contained 10 digits. This time we're doing something a little bit different. We still want to make sure that the phone number contains 10 digits, but it's also divided by the dash symbols. So a phone number has to have the dash symbols passed in so that it can be valid. Then we are creating the address book, and we're initializing the address book as an array called entries. When we initialize it, it initializes it as an empty array. Basically, it's just saying, hey, look, this address book doesn't have anything in it. Then the address book has a few methods. These methods are add entry, which creates an entry using that entry class, and it will create the entry by name, phone, and email, and then it will append those entries or shovel those entries into the entry array. The next method is searching by name. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the next three methods together. Now, the challenge wanted us to be able to search for each entry by a name that's passed in. Now, sometimes when we're searching for an address, we don't necessarily have a name. Sometimes we just have a phone number, or maybe we just have an email address. So I wanted to make sure that we have that built into this this address book. So I've created three methods, each by a different search: name, phone, and email. The search by name checks each entry for the name. If the name is returned or is found, then it returns true. Now, each of these methods are checking for Boolean values to be returned. And the reason for this is if the name or phone or email is found, what's going to happen then is when we're working in the method or menu controller, it's actually going to display the name that is found in the entries or the address book if these return true. If not, then it's going to display that the entry was not found. So again, I'm having these return a Boolean value for the methods. And then finally, the last method in the address book is import CSV file with entries. Now, when we import a CSV file, which is a common separated value file, what it's going to do is it's going to take a look at the path name and then, or the file path, and then it's going to open that file path, and then on each line of the file that's passed in, it's going to create a line info array. And this line info array will be split into three items. The first item is going to be that name item, and again, we're using this file to create entries and then add them into that entries array. So we will call that first method that we looked at, add entry, and we are passing in that add entry method the line info at position 0, which is the name, line info at position 1, which is the phone number, and line info at position 2, and that is going to be the email address. Now what we're going to do to this last entry, the line info position 2, we're actually going to strip the rest of the stuff off the end of that line, because that entry will contain a new line value or something else that will mess up this email address when it's input into the entries array. So we need to make sure that we strip all of that information off of that last entry so that we're just getting the email address when we pass it in. Now, in addition to this import file, what I've done is I've created this count value, and every time an entry is added, I'm going to add a 1 to the count value. Now, what's happening here is that as each entry is passed in, I'm accumulating a count, and when the CSV file is finished adding entries, what it's going to do is it's going to return that count, and then the display in the menu will tell us exactly how many items were passed in when that CSV file was processed. And then, I'm sorry, we did have one more method, and that's going to be the size method, and this just tells us how many entries we have in our entries array, which will of course tell us how many entries we have in our address book. Okay, so that's the address book class. And our final file that we're going to look at is the menu controller. Now this controller is going to do everything, or it's going to display everything that we need for the user to interact with this address book. So we have to make sure that we are requiring relative, the address book and entry, because we're going to be accessing both the address book that we create and the entries so that we can actually display the data from each of those entries. So we create a menu controller class, and we are initializing this menu controller class to a new address book. Now remember, the new address book will basically just be a container for all the entries that we pass in. Now, when the menu is started, we will get this display that we see down in the terminal right now. The display is just telling you, welcome to the address book. It's telling you that we're at the main menu and that there are currently 0 entries. Again, that entries array has nothing in it. So there are currently 0 entries in this address book. Then we get 5 options: view all entries, create an entry, search for an entry, import entries from a CSV, and exit. Now last time we implemented the view all entries and create an entry menu items. So we know we can do that, but just to double check, we can go ahead and make sure. We need to also make sure that we have a validity check for each of those entries that are being added in. So if I want to create an entry, I can try viewing all entries right now, but there's nothing there. So we can create an entry. So we'll select menu item 2, and it says enter a valid name, and it gives you a template, first name, last name, but you don't have to enter a first name and a last name. And the test for the CSV actually tells us that it's just going to enter a first name. So let's go ahead and enter a first name. Now, if we don't enter anything, it would tell us that we need to enter something, or that we need to enter a valid name. So let's go ahead and enter a name. So John. Okay, so at this point, it tells us enter a valid phone number, and it gives you a template for the valid phone number as well. Again, it has to be 3 digits, a dash, 3 digits, a dash, and 4 digits. If we don't pass in 3 digits, a dash, etc., then we should get another ask that says enter a valid phone number. So let's try it. 555, 555, 5555. So 10 digits, but no dashes, and let's see what happens. Okay, so we see it didn't accept just a 10-digit number. The reason I set this up this way is to make sure that when it does actually search for files in the CSV, that it knows what it's searching for. And all numbers passed in using the CSV test file that we have, it gives us 3 digits, a dash, 3 digits, a dash, and 4 digits. So again, I built into the address book that regex file for those entries. So again, it's got to be 3 digits, a dash, 3 digits, a dash, and 4 digits. And then it accepts it. Now again, remember we're using that URI built in to make sure that we're entering a valid email address. So if we enter a blank email address, what happens? It tells us to enter an email address. So let's try a.a.a. And again, that doesn't fall within the valid email address specifications. So again, it's telling us to enter a valid email address. So let's say we enter red at. Again, not a valid email address. So test@test.com. So again, we have the username and then the @ symbol and the domain. And notice now that we have one entry in our address book. Now, when an entry is passed in, it also, when a name is passed in, it sets it up to capitalize the name. So we can pass in all caps, and we still get just a normal name. So if we view this entry right now, notice it's John. But let's say I want to enter another entry, and I'm going to all caps Joe here. Now, again, all caps Joe. The idea is to make sure that Joe looks like a name, so it's going to be capitalized first letter, all lowercase other letters after that. So the next thing we do is phone number 555 555 5554, just to have a different phone number, and then an email address at test1@test.com. Okay, and so we've entered a new name with all caps Joe, so let's go ahead and view the entries. John, that's the first one we created, and then Joe, notice the name there is in the capitalized format, but just the first number or first letter is capitalized. Okay, and notice we also have 2 entries in our address book now. So that's updating as we enter each value or each entry into the address book. Now, we were supposed to test to see whether or not we could search for an entry. Well, we know we have Joe and John in there, so let's go ahead and search for Joe or John and see what happens. Okay, so first thing, we'll choose menu item number 3, and it says, do we want to search by name, phone number, or email address? Well, I remember their names. I don't necessarily remember their phone numbers. Well, I'm saying I don't remember their phone numbers, so let's just go ahead and search by name right now. So the first name that I entered was John. Notice I'm not capitalizing John. I'm just entering all lowercase John, and I search. Now, it didn't find just John, so let's try that again. So lowercase, or now I have to uppercase John, and I forgot to do something. All right, so I need to select whether or not I'm searching by name, phone number, or email. Now I'm going to search by name, so it says enter a valid name. So here I could search for John, all lowercase, and notice it brings up John. And I did search lowercase, and if it was capitalized or all caps, it should still bring up that same name. So let's try again with all caps. So again, we're searching by name, and I'm going to search by John, and again it brings up that entry that we put in earlier. Okay, so what happens if I search for a name that's not in the file? Let's say I search for Rich. Now it should tell me there is no Rich in your address book, and that's exactly what it does. So when it doesn't find a name in the address book, it returns there is no whatever that name was in the address book. Now notice I did implement searching by telephone number, so if I want to search by telephone number, I just select search number 2. Notice I still have to enter that phone number validly. So 555 555 5555. If I don't enter all the dashes where they're supposed to, it should ask me for the phone number again, and it does. So 555 555 5555. Valid phone number. It finds it and it returns that entry, John. Now, if it doesn't find the phone number, let's see what happens. So, searching for a phone or searching for an entry, and I'm going to search by phone number, and I'm going to search by 666, 666, 6666. So, valid phone number has been entered. Phone number not found. Okay, great. And then finally, I need to make sure that I can search by email. So, let's say I remember an email. And it was test@test.com. Notice John comes up. I can search by email. Let's say enter an invalid email. Let's say abc@test.com. Again, you have to have a valid email address or it won't go. So again, it says address not found. So if I enter an invalid email, address not found, enter invalid email address, it tells me to enter it again. So let's say I enter the other email, test1@test.com, and notice it returns Joe at this instance. So now I can test by, or search by name, by phone number, and by email address, and I should get an entry that's returned. Okay, now the next thing in the menu was to import entries via CSV. Now notice that we already have 2 entries that have been passed in. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to load or import this addresses file, this addresses.csv file, which contains 5 names. Each of these has a valid phone number and a valid email address. So I'm going to say import entries via CSV. Now it says enter the file name. Now what this is going to do, and when we go through the method controller, we'll actually see where this happens, but it's actually going to search for the CSV file in the CSV file directory, which we can see right here. All the CSV files should be loaded into the CSV files directory. So if I wanted to create another CSV file, I need to put it there. And this one is called addresses.csv. Enter, and it tells me that 5 entries have been imported. So if I press continue, notice now my address book has updated to contain 7 total entries. Now if I want to view all those entries, I can view them one at a time. I just select option 1, John, Joe, those are the first 2 that I entered manually, then Bill, notice that the addresses CSV file up here, then Bob, Joe, Sally, and Susie. Now, one thing that we should note is I did my manual entry, I entered Joe. And when I search for an entry now, if I search by name and I search the name Joe, I'm actually going to get 2 entries that come back with the name Joe. So let's see what happens here. You'll notice I get 2 Joes. I get Joe with phone number 555 555 5554. That's what I entered manually, and his email is test1@test.com. And then the second Joe is 555 555 3660, and the email is joe@example.com, and this was the Joe that was passed into the CSV file, or with the CSV file, just a second ago. So notice that if I have multiple entries with the same name, it's going to be displayed when I search for those entries. Press continue to bring me back to the main menu, and that should cover everything except for the exit menu item. Now when you exit, what's going to happen is the menu item is going to close out and will be taken back to the terminal window. So go ahead and press 5 and we should get back to our command prompt. And choice 5 and we get a goodbye and we're back at the command prompt. So let's go ahead and clear this screen real fast. And talk about that menu controller. So the menu controller, again, it does the display. Displays, hey look, we're running the menu or the address book, and we get all of our displayed items here. What's passed in here, the display, is also the choice. Now choice just gets input from the user and is going to change that choice to an integer. And if that choice is 5, then it's going to break out of the program and tell us goodbye. However, if it's not 5, what's going to happen then is we're going to call the method selection, and we're going to call it via the choice that we passed in as a user. And then that passes us to the helper method selection, again, which takes the parameter choice. And what it does here is it sets up a switch that if what the choice is, when the choice is 1, we get to see view entries. Choice 2, manual entry. Choice 3, search menu. Choice 4, file selection. Okay, so if we view entries, again, we are viewing each entry. So the entries, our address book is passed in. Entries is iterated over, and for each entry, it clears the screen using system clear, and it displays each entry using the entry display entry, which is the name passed in, phone passed in, and email. And then it holds the screen so that you have time to look at each entry as it's passed in. It doesn't just rush by. And once you press enter, which is what the hold screen does, it's just looking for that carriage return. Press enter to continue, and it's just going to get your carriage return and go on to the next thing. And so that's view entries. Then selection 2 was manual add entry. So here we're just adding an address book entry, and so if we go back to address book, again, notice the add entry just adds an entry to the address book. Now this add entry calls 3 helper methods: enter name, enter phone, and enter email. And again, these helper methods, enter name, just will ask you, again, this is all a validity check, so it creates a name that's an empty string, and while the name is empty, it passes an enter a valid name. Again, if the string is empty, you'll get asked enter a valid name again. Once the name is entered, whatever that name is, it capitalizes or calls the capitalize method on that string, so your name will be in the proper capitalized form. Then it returns name and places it into the add entry. Same thing with phone number, creates an empty string for the phone number, waits for a valid entry, and then passes that along to the add entry. And then finally, enter email, same thing, except it's using that URI to validate the email address. So once that email address is valid, then it passes that email address into the add entry. Okay, so those helper methods are done. Next is the manual search. Now this is going to display a new menu. Again, we need that new menu to, it's asking what do you want to search by, and choose option 1 if you want to search by name, 2 search by phone number, and 3 search by email. And then I've created a search selection helper method that again is a switch, and it's going to search by each of those names. Now, this will run each choice will run a different helper method. The first is display by name, second display by phone, third display by email. Now what this does is it runs that enter name, so it's searching for whatever name you enter, and unless that address book, remember we have the address book search by, we talked about that. We have 3 different search by methods, so if it returns true, then it's going to run through that address book and display the entry if the entry name is equal to name. If it doesn't find the name, then it's going to say there is no name in your address book. And it will hold the screen so that you can actually take a look at the name. The second method was display by phone. Again, same thing. It will just show phone number not found if we don't have any entries with that phone number. Finally, display by email. Again, same thing as phone number, email address not found. If it searches through and there is no email address matching that required email address. Then we have the helper method for the manual import of data. So we need the file selection, and it says enter the file name. Now notice it says enter the file name, not path here. And so it's going to get that file name, and it's going to be called imports, and it's just going to get the user input, cutting off all the end-of-line data and whatnot. And it's going to get the count. Remember, when we import a file, the file will actually return a count value at the end as it imports each of these. So it's calling that import file, and then we have where the path location for the CSV files will be located, and then the actual name of the CSV file here that's been passed into imports. Then once all of those have been passed in, again, we're accumulating a count here. It will print to screen the number of entries that were imported, which again, when we imported the file a few minutes ago, it said 5 entries imported, and it will hold the screen waiting for you to press enter so you can see all of that being displayed. And we've already talked about the hold screen option, or method, so we know what that one does. Now at the bottom of this menu controller, I've added a couple of comments. Now these comments are only for the testing purposes, and it says uncomment the lines below to run the menu. So notice I have the lines uncommented here, which allows me to run the menu. However, when we're running the test, I should say that these will be commented out when I submit the files. However, and this is just to facilitate the actual running of the test. However, it's not necessary, and I'll actually go over that in a second. But it says comment them out to run the test. So if I were to want to just run the test, I would make sure that those were commented out so it didn't go through the whole menu while we were running the file. Now again, this really doesn't matter, and this is really only for testing purposes. So you can actually ignore these lines and keep these lines uncommented, and as I said, I'll go over that in a second. So that just leaves us to taking a look at the spec file that was created to make sure all of this works. Now I've just built upon the spec file that I submitted last time, and the last submit was just making sure that we could add an entry manually, which is what we saw earlier. And then when we searched for an entry, we were just basically making sure that it returned true if the entry was in the address book. We also did the search by phone number and email address as well, which again, this is all built up from the last time. Now the test that we're running this time is we want to make sure that the entries are being added via the CSV file. So again, for each of these specific tests in this, again, I didn't want to put it in the before section because I needed to show that each of these were tests were happening prior to. So it's going to get a little repetitive here, but that's okay. Again, because we are testing specific functionality for each of the should be able to do's. So again, our context here is we should be able to add entries to the address book from a CSV file. Now, the first test that I'm going to do is it should update the address book size. So when we import each of those files in, we are updating it, or we are adding a specific number of files to the address book. And every time we start a new test, we are creating a new address book. So these tests, these previous tests will not affect this in any way. Okay, so when I import the file, which we saw earlier, addresses.csv, there were 5 entries in it, as we can see here, 5 entries. Then the book size that we're looking for should be 5, because we are importing 5 entries. The next test would be, again, we should be able to find the imported entries. And again, this is just using the search that we looked at up here. So it's finding them. If Bill is in the address book, then it should return true. And we do see a Bill in the address book here. And then finally, it should be able to display the found entry. So when we get an entry in the address book, we want to make sure that we're able to display it to the screen. So again, we do the import. So import file, addresses. I'm going to set found to nil. And the reason I'm doing it out here and I'm setting it out here is because I want to be able to access it down below. And what's happening here then is I'm just saying, okay, hey, look, I found an entry, and now I want to have something to check against. So I set check equal to found.display entry. Now, when I run my expect, I'm expecting the check, and then found display entry, which would be running off of the entry class. It should return name, phone, and email, etc. So I'm checking it against name, Bill, phone, 555-555-4854, and email is bill@example.com. So again, if we find an entry, and remember the entry I'm looking for specifically is Bill, this data should be what's going to display to screen, and this is pretty much what I'm mocking up here. So let's go ahead and run those tests. Now remember earlier I said if I want to run the tests, or if I want the test to be run, then we need to comment out these lines. But I'm going to show you that you don't have to do that to see the tests run. So let's go ahead and run the test right now, and I'm just going to do the generic bundle exec rspec to run all the rspec files in the folder. So you're actually going to see it run the entry spec, the menu controller spec, and the address book spec all at the same time. So we want to make sure that specifically we're running this address book spec. Now, when we run the spec file, it should say that all of the spec files pass. So let's go ahead and do that. Run bundle exec rspec, and notice it brings up the menu screen. That's because we didn't have those lines commented out at the bottom. So what's happening is when it runs the menu controller, which it will do eventually, it's going to run into the new session, and it's going to run into the display of that session, and we'll actually run each of those items in the display and do all of that for this. So that actually happens, and it's running through the program itself. But remember, we wanted to do the test. So in order to get to the testing portion, we have to actually exit out of the display. So you just press 5 to exit from the menu, and then it runs all the tests that it should run. It runs the address book tests, so it's going to pass all the address book tests, and here are the tests that we added in the last part, so the additional tests that we added in for this specific challenge. And then it runs the entry tests and the controller test as well. So 15 tests were run, there are 0 failures, and it didn't really take all that long to do. Now again, if I wanted to just run the tests themselves, I would comment out those 2 lines there, and then I could run the tests. Oh, I forgot to save it. So again, comment out those 2 lines, make sure you save the file, and run the test. Notice it didn't run the menu that time, it just did what it was supposed to do. And so all the tests pass, there are no failures, and that's it. So if there are any questions, please post them into the forum on veterans.topcoder, and I will answer them as soon as I possibly can. Thank you.